This book, Mary, was written by the wonderful author and my friend, Janis Cooke Newman. It is a novel of Mary Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, like you have never seen her before. I encourage you all to read it. It is a wonderful examination of her life as well as womanhood in the 19th century in the era that she lived. Just to give you a little bit of a setup, the novel takes the form of a diary or a memoir that Mary herself has written as she is confined in a lunatic asylum, which in fact she was for the latter part of her life. She was released some years before her death, but she spent a good amount of time there. So this is her memory of her life. She was a remarkable woman. Everyone thinks of her as a lunatic, and she did have some emotional problems, certainly. But she was the first woman to be called First Lady. She was a political strategist who helped her husband immensely, especially in the early years when it was not frowned upon. When she was in the public eye, it was a little more difficult for her to be a visible supporter or strategist of her husband. Anyway, I'm going to read a section for you that is about her efforts to alleviate the suffering of some of the soldiers in the hospital that is in Washington City. In other words, there were many, many hospitals, but this particular one is called Mount Pleasant. And again, I apologize if I run out of steam. Like so many soldiers' hospitals that had been hastily built about Washington City, Mount Pleasant was not much more than a cavernous barracks occupied by wounded soldiers and blowflies. When I first began to visit, I brought gifts which had been sent to the president's house, baskets of whiskey and homemade cakes. But after learning that a great many soldiers suffered from scurvy, I always brought oranges, saving them for the victims of the illness, whom I recognized by their gums turned swollen and purple as grapes. One of these was Sergeant Tobias Warren, who was of the same age as my son, Robert, and nearly as handsome, save for the scurvy, which had turned his gums to bleed over his teeth, dyeing them pink. Sergeant Warren had been wounded in the hand. A bullet had passed through the center of his palm, severing the nerves so that his fingers curled in upon themselves like a flower made of flesh. It was his right hand which was wounded, and on the day that I met him, I saw that he struggled with his left to peel his orange. "Let me do that for you," I offered. I took back the orange and pulled off the skin, placing the sections into his uninjured palm. "I don't expect anybody will believe that the First Lady fed me oranges." Sergeant Warren was from Indiana and spoke in a slurred drawl that reminded me of my husband. "Nobody except my son," I confided, "who does not consider any status I might achieve excuse to neglect my mothering." I brought Sergeant Warren oranges for a week, and at the end of it, he asked if I would help write a letter to his mother. I found paper and ink and sat beside Sergeant Warren's bed as he dictated the letter. The correspondence was nearly 3 pages long. In it, he used the word love 4 times. As summer shifted into autumn, I continued to visit with Sergeant Warren. His scurvy lessened and his gums no longer bled, but I still brought him oranges, still peeled them and placed them in his uninjured hand. Once, before I could drop the sections into his palm, he reached up and wrapped the fingers of that hand around my own, held it long enough to let me know the gesture was done from affection, not to say that he did not want oranges or to relay any practical message. Each time I came, I was surprised to discover that the sergeant was still in his bed, for he appeared to me to be only slightly wounded. "Sergeant Warren is plagued with fevers," muttered Mount Pleasant's chief doctor, a man of near 70 who had retired and now resented the war for taking him out of it. I was sorry to learn that the sergeant was not entirely well, but I was always happy to see him there. At times I pretended that Sergeant Warren was my son Robert, my eldest son gone to war, now returned, lightly wounded, but altered, made more affectionate toward the living when faced so forcibly with death. If this were Robert, I thought, I would bring him oranges and anything else he desired. I would hold his injured hand and take it to my breast and kiss it. And for once I would be entirely successful nursing back to health a son who needed it. Upon an afternoon near the close of October, an autumn day of hard brightness, I came to Mount Pleasant and discovered another soldier in Sergeant Warren's bed. At last he is recovered, I told myself, and I went looking for the doctor to learn whether the handsome sergeant had been sent back to the war or home to his mother, as I wished. I found the irritable old gentleman stitching together a rough-edged wound. "Warren?" he asked in response to my question. I pointed to the bed in which Sergeant Warren had passed most of the summer. The doctor squinted through blowflies, then turned back to his stitching. "Dead," he told me. "That cannot be right," I said to him. "Sergeant Warren had a small wound, and it was very nearly healed." The doctor put the end of a new piece of stitching thread in his mouth, wetting it for the needle. "Poisoning of the blood," he muttered. "It happens with some frequency." The stench of gangrene, which the autumn afternoon could not blow away, slid into my nose and throat, filled up my mouth, until I tasted the sweetish scent of the body turning upon itself, poisoning its own blood, blackening its own limbs. This is the smell of death, I thought, and it will find Robert upon a battlefield or in a hospital like this one full of blowflies. It will seek from here, and it will find Taddy too, feeding upon his fevers and turning his blood against him. Then it will come seeking my husband, lodging itself in his wasted frame which has no strength to fight it. It will come, this stench which carries death, to everyone I love, the way it has already come to Willie and to Eddie. For I am cursed in a way which draws it to those who mean the most to me. My oranges fell to the floor, rolling beneath the soldiers' cots, and I turned and ran between the long row of beds, hurrying past the men who had already paid the hospital's tax of an arm or a leg, and those who still hoped not to. I needed to stand in the wind and let it blow the sting of death from my clothes so I would not carry it home. I rushed from the building. I ran to the first carriage I saw and threw myself into it. "Drive," I cried to the man seated upon the bench. "Where?" he asked me. "Any place that is not here. Take me out of this quarter," I called up. I need a destination. I thought for only a moment. "Pennsylvania Avenue," I told him. After Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania Avenue's brilliant shops glowed with life. The windows showed silks instead of wrapping bandages, boots which were only sold in pairs, gloves fashioned for unfurled fingers. "Let me down here," I said to the driver, for I needed to walk in this air which was sweetened only by the scent of perfume and new leather. The pavement of Pennsylvania Avenue felt safe and solid beneath my feet. I walked until I had ceased to smell death, then slowed and gazed into windows filled with objects which were new and unbroken. In one, a silver tea service sat shining upon a velvet-covered pedestal. The service was so bright with reflected light from the store's gas lamps, it seemed that it generated the radiance upon its own. "I must see that service close," I told the desk clerk inside. "It is made of a high grade of silver," he said, placing the shining pieces before me. "Very lasting." I removed my gloves and ran my hands along the smooth, undamaged surfaces. All was unmarked, untainted, and if any of it should blacken, I could polish it back to brightness. "Have this sent to the president's house," I said to the clerk, although I already owned a tea service and had no need of another. When the service arrived, I had the boxes brought to my room, where I sat upon the bed and unpacked every piece of it. I held the sugar bowl and the creamer in my hands, and their gleaming weight seemed a promise that the infection which sickened limbs would not find Robert, that whatever it was which poisoned blood would keep from Taddy. The serving pot offered me assurance that my husband would survive the burdens of his office, that the war would not eat out his life. I kept the silver service in my closet, where I might look upon it whenever I felt the need of its unmarred durability. 2 days later, when Robert wrote again, begging to go back to war, and a hint of the gangrene filled my nose and mouth, I returned to the shop and purchased a set of silver plates to keep it company.